Thank you for joining us this afternoon on the session of Get the Lead Out, Updates of EPA Assessments in Residential Soil. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Sharon Cooperstein is the manager for the Science Policy Branch in the Office of Superfund Remediation and Technology Innovation at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. At EPA, Sharon previously worked in the Office of Policy in the Administrator's Office. With over a decade of experience as an analyst, Sharon holds a Bachelor's of Science in Biology and Society from Cornell University, and a Master's in Science and Natural Resource Science from the University of Nebraska. Please start, Sharon.
Thanks, Melissa. Really nice to see everyone here today. As Melissa said, I work in EPA headquarters in the Superfund program, and I will be speaking about an update to our residential soil lead screening guidance that we issued this past January. The guidance protects families and children from lead in soil. Our updated guidance lowers lead screening levels and strengthens EPA's guidance for investigating and cleaning up lead-contaminated soil in residential areas at Superfund and RCRA corrective action sites. The updated guidance was developed to ensure that we're using the latest and best available science to protect children living and playing near sites contaminated by lead in soil. The updated guidance reflects the administration's commitment to protecting communities from lead, especially disadvantaged and overburdened communities facing multiple sources of lead. The guidance supports EPA's priority of recognizing the potential cumulative impacts from multiple sources of lead in a community, and it's consistent with EPA's lead strategy and all of the regulatory actions that EPA has been taking to protect communities from lead. Next slide, please. The updated guidance establishes screening levels for the early stages of investigations at a Superfund site. EPA now recommends a screening level of 200 parts per million when investigating residential areas with lead in soil. Additionally, the guidance recommends a screening level for residential areas with multiple exposure sources of lead. For areas where there are other sources of lead exposure, like lead paint, lead in water, or lead in the ambient air, EPA recommends screening at 100 parts per million. Both of these levels are significant reductions from our previous recommended screening level of 400 parts per million. Next slide, please, Melissa. It's important to note that screening levels are not cleanup levels. Screening levels are used when initially investigating a release to determine if the level of contamination warrants further investigation. As a result of these lowered screening levels, we expect to investigate more residential properties for lead contamination and potential cleanup. Additionally, at sites where we've previously conducted a cleanup, we do expect the properties that we've cleaned to remain protective. However, the site footprint may grow, and so properties that previously did not require cleanup may be determined to require cleanup. The guidance doesn't dictate a specific response action by EPA or other entities, and it doesn't specify any cleanup level. The cleanup levels that are applied at a given site are developed on a site-specific basis using site-specific factors. EPA conducts a risk assessment and takes community input on those cleanup levels and considers the background levels of lead in the community, all to arrive at that site-specific cleanup level. Next slide, please. Additionally, as a companion to the updated residential soil lead policy, EPA updated our Superfund residential lead site handbook. The Superfund Residential Lead Sites Handbook is a resource guide for remedial project managers, on-scene coordinators, and risk assessors that are evaluating residential lead sites. The handbook identifies tools and summarizes best practices to promote consistency and provide flexibility in site cleanup decisions. The updates capture advances in the tools and best practices which have evolved since EPA first issued the handbook in 2003. We've redesigned the format of the handbook to ensure that it is easily updatable, and each chapter of the handbook is a module that can be updated or modified as new information and experience are gathered. The Residential Lead Sites Handbook is publicly available on our website, as is the guidance. I did not include those URLs in this presentation, but I'm happy to send those to folks or pop them in the chat at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. Some of the important updates to the handbook are that we've expanded the chapters on community involvement, health education, and site characterization. We also updated and reorganized several chapters, including the one on institutional controls, 5-year reviews for Superfund sites, and access and enforcement. And finally, we added a new chapter on Superfund site teams and collaboration to recommend the members of a site team and their roles and responsibilities, and to introduce the important work that the agency has been doing on collaboration at residential lead Superfund sites. Next slide, please. We also added a chapter on risk assessment to provide the most recent science and tools, especially the updated tools for assessing bioavailability of lead at sites and assessing human health risk at lead contamination residential lead sites. Chapter 9 on implementation of cleanup levels has been updated and expanded to provide guidance on prioritizing actions within a residential Superfund site and to provide the most recent tools and best practices when applying a cleanup level, including alternate cleanup methods for other than excavation and hauling the contaminated soil. We added a chapter on source attribution for lead contamination at Superfund site to provide information for assessment at lead sites where source attribution techniques may be utilized to better inform site management decisions. Next slide, please.
So
well, I can just say, I thought I had one more slide, but I'm happy to just say verbally that our next steps in implementing the guidance are that we are heading back. EPA regions are in the field sampling sites. It will take some time before new remedial actions get underway. Right now, EPA regions are prioritizing which sites and areas to assess first. We generally prioritize those areas based on risk to people and the environment. Next, we'll evaluate and act. We'll evaluate how the updated guidance impacts sites on a site-by-site basis, and we'll decide on next steps by following our established decision-making process, including robust community engagement and public input. And finally, we'll work with state partners and communities. We'll continue to work with our partners as we do throughout the Superfund program, including states and tribal governments and communities. This includes government-to-government consultation where site-specific decisions may affect tribal interests. And last, I'll note, we did accept public input on the updated guidance. We opened a docket and we were accepting input, and actually we are still accepting input until today is the last day to provide comments. And we've gotten some great feedback so far. And that concludes my presentation. Thanks so much.
thank you, Sharon. At this time, I'd like to introduce John Banks. John is a senior remedial project manager in EPA Region 3, Site Remediation Branch. And he has been with EPA for 37 years. John has worked on a number of lead sites, including the characterization and cleanup of over 500 lead-contaminated residential properties impacted by the operations of a former secondary lead smelter. Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll be doing a brief discussion on the residential lead screening checklist and residential sampling. Next slide, please. So EPA has developed a residential lead screening level checklist to guide remedial site teams through the selection and documentation of the appropriate residential lead screening level by evaluating lines of evidence available in a variety of national data sets, as well as local and other site-specific information. The checklist has 3 tables, and you can see in the figure to the right is a screenshot of the first page of the checklist and table 1. Table 1 is where you're going to document the primary lead data source information, and the 2 primary determinations are whether the site is within the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, non-attainment area for lead, and are the majority of homes at the site above the EJ Screen 80th percentile lead paint index. EPA also developed a GIS tool to assist in making these determinations, and I'll cover that a little bit more in the next slide. Now, table 2 is where you're going to document secondary lead sources on potential lead exposures. These may include things like the presence of homes with lead-based paint, facilities nearby that have lead violations, knowledge of lead plumbing or lead service lines affecting drinking water, or information about blood lead levels in the community. Table 3 is where you're going to document information on mitigation efforts or programs like, does the state, tribe, or territory have an EPA-authorized lead-based paint program? Is your study area covered by a lead ordinance or local lead laws? Or do you have any knowledge of things like lead water service line replacements that have occurred within the study area? You would then use a weight of evidence approach based upon these lines of evidence to determine whether or not the 200 or 100 part per million risk screening level is appropriate for your site, and document that decision in the checklist. The checklist is then signed off on by EPA Remedial Management. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, EPA developed a residential GIS screening tool to help in answering the questions in table 1 of the checklist. And there is a link for the GIS tool that can be found in the checklist. The GIS tool combines available national data sets on Superfund site boundaries, information from the EJ Screen lead paint indicator, and information on the NAAQS non-attainment areas. You can enter any city or area of interest, and the tool will generate a map and information that's associated with that specified area. So as an example, what I'm showing here is a snapshot of the GIS tool for the output for the Price Battery Superfund site in Hamburg, Pennsylvania. And as you can see here, there is a color-coded key for the different elements that the GIS tool is showing you. In this screenshot, you can see the boundaries of the Price Battery site, and that significant portion of the Price Battery site is actually above the 90th percentile for lead-based paint. The GIS tool also indicates that the Price Battery site is not in a non-attainment area for lead. Next slide, please. So over the next few slides, I'm going to briefly touch upon some of the key considerations and best practices for lead site characterization. So the first step in any site characterization is to develop and document the sampling approach. Sampling methodologies and analytical methods to be used. This includes the development of your sampling and analysis plan, field sampling plan, your quality assurance project plan, conceptual site model, and data quality objectives. These are all important steps to make sure you obtain sufficient, sound, and defensible lead data that you can base your site decisions on. Your site team, and in particular your risk assessor, should be included when developing these plans. So preparing the CSM is also a key step in this process, because it's where you're going to identify the lead-specific exposure pathways that are going to be quantified in the human health risk assessment, and development of your preliminary remediation goals for the site. The CSM is a living document and should continually be updated as you gather more data and site information about your site. Next slide, please. So when characterizing a lead site, you're also going to want to characterize the background soil lead concentrations and the site-specific lead bioavailability. Determining background lead concentrations is important for making risk management decisions and because EPA generally doesn't clean up sites to below background concentrations. In urban areas, lead background concentrations may be elevated and could already be near or above the lead risk screening levels. Background reference areas should include both natural and non-site related anthropogenic sources and should be collected from reference areas near the site, but not close enough to be impacted by contamination from the site. Background reference areas should also have the same basic characteristics of your site, such as zoning and land use, traffic density, housing age, lot size, and soil type, among other things. EPA also recommends that site-specific lead bioavailability data be collected at lead-contaminated sites. Lead bioavailability is an important input to the blood lead risk assessment models like the IUBK model and improves the accuracy of the human health risk assessment and can result in remediation goals that differ significantly from the remediation screening levels. In the past, bioavailability determinations had to rely on in vivo methods, which were basically animal studies that were expensive and time-consuming. But now there is an in vitro method, which is a laboratory bioaccessibility assay method that can be used to determine soil lead bioavailability and is cheaper and faster than the in vivo methods. Next slide, please. So exposure units, decision units, and sampling units is a sampling design strategy that should be used for residential soil sampling and decision making. The strategy is developed site-specifically during the development of the sampling and analysis plan, your QAPP, and your data quality objectives. Residential lead exposures should be evaluated on a property-by-property basis. And the figure on this page shows one example of how a residential yard can be divided into different units. If properties are large, you may want to collect enough samples to characterize lead concentrations across portions of the yard, like the front yard separately from the backyard, so you can make decisions just for those portions of the yard. Lead concentrations in drip zones around the house can be higher because of the influence of exterior lead-based paint. So you may want to make the drip zone separate decision units in your sampling. And finally, you also want to consider areas of the yard where contact is more likely and characterize those areas separately from the rest of the yard. So for example, if the yard has play areas or garden areas, you may want to make those areas separate decision or sampling units as well, and collect enough samples from the play areas and garden areas to estimate the lead concentration separately from the rest of the yard. Next slide, please. So this slide presents a list of the various areas and media of residential properties that can be sampled. You may want to consider these when you're developing your sampling plan, but not all these areas or media are necessarily applicable at every site. So the site team should consider which of these may apply to their particular site. I'm not going to go into detail on a lot of these. They're discussed more fully in the 2024 Residential Lead Handbook, and the handbook goes into a lot more detail. But what I do want to mention is a special consideration for sampling interior dust. Lead and household dust may represent an important exposure pathway, but it can also include contributions from lead-based paint, which isn't addressed under Superfund authority. And interior lead dust concentrations can fluctuate over time, depending on how frequently the home is vacuumed or cleaned, and that can pose significant logistical challenges for sampling. The IUBK model does include a module that predicts house dust lead concentration from outdoor soil concentration, so sampling dust, interior dust generally isn't necessary. But if you do make the decision to sample interior dust, EPA's Technical Review Workgroup Lead Committee should be consulted when designing sampling plans for the collection of indoor dust samples. Next slide, please. And finally, there are several different types of soil sampling methods that can be used for collecting soil samples. Incremental composite sampling is the preferred sampling approach for residential lead sites. An ICS sample is made up of a large number of anywhere from 30 to 100 samples of equivalent size based on the size of the decision unit. These samples are thoroughly homogenized, and then a subsample is taken from the homogenized soil. The figure on the right shows an ICS sampling strategy based on a grid pattern and conducted in triplicate. ICS sampling is preferred because it produces an unbiased and reproducible mean concentration of lead in soils with less variability and is cost-effective approach to sampling. There's also composite sampling. This is made up of a smaller number of soil samples, typically fewer than 10 samples, that are combined in the field during sampling, and a subsample is taken from the combined soil and sent for analysis. The composite samples can reduce small-scale variability by physically combining the samples from a small area and may be appropriate for small areas such as drip zones and play areas that are too small to support triplicate ICS sampling. And finally, we have discrete sampling. This is a common sampling method where individual discrete samples are collected from a single sampling location, and then you'll get a result that is an individual concentration for each sampling point. Unlike ICS, though, to get an average lead soil concentration from discrete sampling, you would have to mathematically calculate the mean concentration from all those separate results. And with discrete sampling, the individual sample point concentrations can be highly variable at both small and large spatial scales, and that may result in underestimating or overestimating the soil lead concentrations in a yard unless you collect a lot of samples to try and reduce that variability. And finally, I do want to mention X-ray fluorescence, or XRF, which is a field portable instrument that can be used as a useful screening method to quantify lead and soil concentrations because it's fast, cheap, and relatively easy to implement and provides you real-time data results. And I know that Erik will be giving a presentation on XRF in the field. Thank you.
Thank you, John. As mentioned, our next speaker is Erik Armistead. Erik is an on-scene coordinator with EPA Region 3, who has supported lead assessments and cleanups for EPA for over the past 19 years at various former lead smelters throughout Region 3, the former Moore Orchard site in Schwenksville, Pennsylvania, multiple battery recycling facility cleanups, and John T. Lewis in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and numerous community soil kitchens.
Thank you, Melissa. So yeah, I will be talking about how we utilize the XRF mainly for in-field screening and sampling activities, which gives us some added value in being able to get results quickly for a relatively lower cost and still have quality data. So going into your sampling, really the first thing you need to think about is kind of what your goals are. Because this can be used from various different types of activities, anything from emergency responses where you need data basically real time to make decisions immediately, to situations where you have a lot more time, such as assessments where you have a lot of time to prepare. You'll be getting your results back and probably have some time to determine what you're going to need with those results. So in that sort of situation, you're going to want more, you can focus more on the accuracy and precision of your results, and then things in between. So a lot of our removal or cleanup actions, we want highly defensible data, But if we're digging up a yard, we don't want to stop and sample and wait for results for a week. So all these different types of situations, the field XRF is something that can be used to really get us data quickly and still very effectively. We also have other kind of smaller events. Soil kitchens are something we often do, where the public can bring in soil from their yards and gardens and such, and we can screen them there to provide them results. Oftentimes we have other resources at these screening events, whether the state or the city or the CDC, who can consult with the residents based on those results. So we still want real-time results provided, but we certainly want accurate, defensible data to provide. So really at the beginning of your assessment, you want to define what your criteria are for going into this. Next slide. And so in situ screening is really geared towards that emergency response, quick data side of things. So there you can basically take the XRF, which you can see in those photos, apply it directly to your sample location and get a result for how much lead is in that soil. There is a procedure documented in EPA Field Method 6200. It focuses on a much larger activity for doing soils, but there is a few section or two in there that focuses on the in situ screening. So while that seems you can just start it quick, there are a few steps you can do to make sure you're still getting quality data that it talks about there. So one thing is your calibration. There's certain calibration steps you can take to make sure your instrument is reading correctly. And there's also soil standards. You can have known concentrations of lead and other metals that you run at the beginning and end of your job to make sure that that XRF is running correctly. There's also the procedures that you do when you screen that soil. So you don't want to screen the grass. So you want to peel back that vegetation. You want to remove large rocks and debris from your location. You want to make sure it's dry. If the soil is overly wet, then it can bias your readings low, which nobody wants. So you want to make sure it's a relatively dry spot. And then you want to make sure it's flat and relatively compact. So you can use anything from a tamper to a trowel, anything to make sure that soil is compacted a little bit. And then depending on the data that you're seeing, this generally run anywhere from a 30-second to a 2-minute analysis. Next slide. Then kind of the next step along the line is when you want to bag that soil. It takes a little bit more time, but you can still have a basically added level of precision and accuracy. And you're actually checking the precision and accuracy for each of your samples. So we use a guidance here that EPA Region 4 created. It's the Superfund X-ray Fluorescence Field Operations Guide. And the idea here is that you're collecting soil from the ground into a plastic bag. You're still doing all those steps that was talked about with in situ. You want to make sure there's no rocks, minimal vegetation mixed in there. You want to run your calibration standards and all that. But then you're basically homogenizing that soil, make sure it's good and mixed inside the bag. And you're going to be taking multiple readings from that bag, which you run in spreadsheets, which are provided in that field operations guide to make sure that you're getting good replication among your readings. And it basically calculates an upper level of what the lead concentrations would be in that sample with a good confidence in what your readings are going to be. Usually these can be run a little bit shorter time period, 30 to 60 seconds, because you have kind of that added level of prep. There's obviously other options. You can run it through a larger sieve to remove rocks if you have that issue with your soils, and or take moisture readings, because again, you generally want that soil to be relatively dry, less than 10 to 20% moisture. Next slide. And then method 6200 again, which I talked about for the in situ stuff, it actually focuses around doing a full field laboratory with a lot of steps, but provides highly defensible data. This is relatively time intensive, but you can still get results much quicker than if you're sending it off to a lab for a week-long turnaround or something. But as you can see in some of these steps, you generally dry these samples in a oven for about 2 to 4 hours. You're going to grind it down with a mortar and pestle. You'll sieve it through a number of screens, but usually down to about a number 60, and then place it in XRF cups, which are some of those plastic cups you can see in the background of one of those photos. It's a 5-gram sample of soil that ends up in there. And that's what is then analyzed on the XRF. Anywhere from, again, kind of the 30 seconds is the minimum up to 2 minutes, or 2 to 4 minutes we've seen when people want really, really precise data. Basically, these XRFs are taking readings continuously, so the longer it runs, generally the more focused that reading will be. There's additional QC steps in that full method where you're preparing silicon dioxide blanks and running those to make sure no contamination is introduced into your process. And one of the most time-consuming steps of it, beyond the 2 to 4 hours of drying, is decontamination, because in between every sample, you're needing to decontaminate the mortar and pestle, needing to decontaminate the sieves, rather than the other two methods, which are really focused around being able to do things quickly. So where you're using plastic bags, which can just be thrown out, here you're using containers, which need to be decontaminated. Next slide. And then there's other roles for the XRF on these sites. We've used it for lead paint screening to determine if lead paint is on structures. It gives you an instantaneous result for that. And we've also used it for wipes and for dust screening. So we can often take a wipe from a defined area, such as in the bottom right photo there, and determine how much lead is present in dust that's within that structure. We've often done that to make sure people aren't carrying contamination out of the zone of a contaminated area, or to see if people are bringing, if their yard's contaminated, to see if anything's being brought inside the home, and make sure all of that is looked at. Next slide. There we go. So next is,
Yep,
go ahead,
thank
Melissa.
you, Eric. Before I introduce the next speaker, I just want to remind folks that you can enter any questions that you have into the chat, and then we will address them during the question and answer session. So I would like to introduce Martin Gehlhaus at this time. Martin is in his 20th year with EPA. He spent 10 years developing toxicity assessments in EPA's Office of Research and Development, and joined Region 3 in 2014. He is currently the Senior Human Health Risk Assessor and provides technical expertise in remediating Superfund sites in the region. Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. Good afternoon, everyone. And we heard some really good presentations about guidance and sampling and screening. And what I'd like to do is take the next 9 or 10 minutes to introduce and discuss, summarize a little bit how the EPA evaluates lead in risk assessment. And this is EPA's IEUBK model for lead in children. IEUBK stands for Integrated Exposure Uptake Biokinetic. Next slide, please. The IEUBK is a software package that estimates blood lead levels in children under 7 years old who are exposed to lead contaminated media. This model is used to assess risk and support environmental cleanup decisions at residential sites. The model does not predict a blood lead for a specific child, but instead allows for estimates for a hypothetical child or population of similarly exposed children. Next slide, please. So the IUBK model is made up of 3 components. The first component is the exposure component. The model has individual subcomponents for soil, dust, air, drinking water, and diet. Generally, we have information for soil concentrations. And as John referenced, we have household dust. If we have data for soil concentrations, we also will have default concentrations that are built into the model for dust, air, drinking water, and diet. The second component is uptake. This component considers the processes by which lead intake, and that's lead that has entered the child's body through ingestion or inhalation, is transferred to the blood plasma. Only a fraction of the lead entering the body through the respiratory or GI tract is absorbed into the systemic circulation. And we also have different bioavailabilities of lead from different environmental media. And John also referenced this as bioavailability of lead. The bioavailability of lead is the fraction that is ingested that is then absorbed by the body. And you will have varying bioavailabilities depending on soil characteristics and individuals. Next slide, please. The third component is the biokinetic component. This component models the movement of absorbed lead throughout the body over time by physiologic or biochemical processes. And this is really what differentiates lead risk assessment from the risk assessment of other chemicals by the agency. We have a good understanding of the transfer of absorbed lead between blood and other body tissues, and that is incorporated into the model. Lead is there's elimination of lead from the body via urine, feces, skin, and the growth of hair and nails. This is also incorporated. And then we also have the storage and disposition of lead in extracellular fluids, red blood cells, and other organs of the body. The IUBK model also considers a variability, and the model also addresses variability in blood lead concentrations among exposed children. Children having contact with the same concentrations of environmental lead can develop very different lead concentrations due to differences in behavior, household characteristics, and individual patterns of lead uptake and biokinetics. Next slide, please. This is a great graphic that shows the biological structure of the IUBK model. And what you'll notice are the 3 components: exposure, uptake, and the biokinetic component. This demonstrates the sources of exposure: air, dust, diet, soil, and water in the first component, exposure to environmental lead, and the absorption, which is the middle component, and processing of lead by the human body. The development of the model used data from a variety of scientific studies of lead biokinetics, contact rates of children with contaminated media, and data on the presence and behavior of environmental lead. Next slide, please. The IUBK model has 2 outputs that you can select at the end of the model approach itself. The first is how we estimate or calculate risk. And lead risk assessment in the agency is a bit different than the traditional cancer, non-cancer approach. Again, that goes back to the good understanding that we have of lead absorption and distribution and compartmentalization in the body. So when we evaluate lead, we are looking at a percentage that exceeds our blood lead threshold level. Now, when we look at this figure, the vertical line is going straight up and down. That is our target blood lead threshold. And for this model run, we used 5 micrograms per deciliter. The output of the run is the S-shaped curve, and that's the probability distribution and we see that it goes from 100% at zero, at a blood target of 0, and it tapers down as we move across the x-axis. Next slide, please. So within lead risk assessment, what we are most interested in is that portion of the distribution that exceeds our blood lead target. In this case, if you'll notice that small print that says percentage above, in this model run, that percentage above was 4.979. So we are right at we are right at the 5% that we're using as our exceedance of the blood threshold level. So it's that upper tail of the distribution that indicates the fraction of the population that exceeds our threshold level when the children have the same exposure history. Now, again, I'd like to reemphasize, the IUBK model does not estimate risk for a specific child, but rather for a population of children. And again, the goal is to be below 5% probability of exceeding the target blood lead level. Next slide, please. The second output of the IUBK model is that we can calculate remediation goals. And we do that by selecting specific output parameters. In this case, if you'll notice the text that says change cutoff, that is our blood lead target. So that's our threshold, again, for what we are using to demonstrate an exceedance or a risk. And then we have a probability of exceeding the cutoff. And for this model run, we used a blood lead target of 5 micrograms per deciliter. And following our guidance, we used a 5% probability of exceeding our blood lead threshold. So what we're doing is we're running this model and we're saying, what is our soil concentration that would result in 5% of our probability distribution or population exceeding our blood lead threshold? So when we run that, this bottom number that says soil and or dust concentration, that's the remediation goal that we end up with as calculated. So based on a blood lead target of 5 and the probability of exceeding of 5%, our remediation goal for this model run would be 200 parts per million or 200 milligrams per kilogram. So I thank you for your time today, and I hope that was a nice rundown of the IUBK model. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And we have a number of questions that have come in. So one of our first questions was, is there any residential risk assessment standards for other chemicals such as mercury dioxins, furans, etc., like the lead one shared?
Yeah, this is Martin Gehlhaus. If we have risk assessment approaches for chemicals that we can analyze for and are detected at in-site media. What makes lead different is, again, our good understanding of absorption, distribution, and then compartmentalization and biokinetics of lead in the human body. So that gives us an opportunity to look at lead a bit differently than we do traditional risk assessment, for volatile organics in groundwater or other metals in soil and groundwater. So it's that good understanding of the lead biokinetics that allows us to develop a model like this.
Thank you, Martin. We have one more for you, it looks like. The model that you presented, can this model be modified to use with other age groups than what you discussed? Or can it be modified to estimate lead levels in animals?
It is not used to estimate blood lead in animals. We do have some built-in selections where you can look at different age groups, but it is developed for use in children from age 0 to 7. But we can make some selections of age ranges within that 0 to 7.
Thank you, Martin. It looks like we have another one that you can answer. Is it the intention of EPA to use the new all ages lead model version 3.0 to assess lead risks at either residential or commercial and industrial sites?
That's a really good question. That was recently released and released by the agency. It is my understanding that the all ages lead model is currently only for use for research, academic purposes. We do not have any guidance at this moment about how to apply it in risk assessment.
Thank you.
And if I can just jump in and add to that response,
Sure.
as Martin said, the all ages lead model was released recently by EPA's Office of Research and Development publicly. And our program, the Superfund program, continues to work with the Office of Research Development on the evaluation of its use, potential future use for our sites, but we're not currently using it to support cleanup decisions.
Thank you, Sharon. So another question is the GIS tool that was shown during John's presentation. Is that publicly available?
I can jump in and answer that. The checklist is available through the web, and I think, Melissa, that you provided that link into the chat. The GIS tool is not currently accessible to the public, but I think we are looking at whether we can make future versions publicly available.
Thank you.
Oh, and that said, all the data that supports it, I think, is in other various publicly available GIS. There are tools that have it. I just don't know which tools they are, but I can look into it and provide those links.
That'd be great. And as we compile the answers to these questions, we'll be able to add them in the public information that's released with the recording of this video. So if folks have other questions that they want to type into the chat, they can go ahead and submit those.
Melissa, I'm just going to pop on and give the 2-minute warning.
Sure.
So if people do have any final questions, now is the time to submit. And then after that, we will do our closeout.
And we did get one more question. Are there any plans to update the industrial removal screening level value and guidance based on changes to CDC blood reference values? They're citing the 800 milligram per kilogram RSL value.
Yeah, I can jump in there, Melissa. Our priority was residential lead sites because we think that's where the exposures are most of greatest concern, most opportunity for children to be playing there. I do think that OLEM will begin, that's the Office of Land and Emergency Management at EPA will begin considering updating the industrial screening and removal levels. I don't have a timeline for that yet, but I think it's something that we're likely to visit. I will note quickly, though, that while we did consider all the updated science that shows that there's no threshold effect for lead, that there are health effects of lead at every concentration, every blood lead level studied. The CDC blood lead reference level is not a health-based value, so that did not necessarily directly inform our update. It was the science, the robust body of scientific evidence that we relied on in this current update to the residential soil lead guidance, and we would rely on similar science in the update to the industrial screening level.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you to all of our presenters, to Martin, to John, to Erik, and Sharon. We have hit our time limit at this point, and we thank all the participants for listening, submitting your questions, and been active participants today.
Thank you all for joining the summit. We're going to quickly share a closing video. If you just stick around.
Hey, everybody, I want to thank you for stepping up and stepping into the Mid-Atlantic Summit this year. Whether it's your first time or whether you've been here before, we're glad that you participated and listened and learned and feel empowered. So whether you're a community member, an environmental justice crusader, an academic, a scientist, a student leader, a resident who just showed up to listen and find out how they can help, we just want to thank you for whatever you're doing in your leadership role, whether it's in your business or in your university or even in your household. It matters. I also want to thank all the speakers and moderators who shared their experiences and wisdom today. I want to thank Tom Perez from the White House, my boss, EPA Deputy Administrator Janet McCabe, our state secretaries. We had tremendous participation, and we talk all the time. So those of you in the state should know that your principals are having a lot of conversations with us here at EPA on a consistent basis. I want to thank our meteorologists. We don't usually have meteorologists, but they have an incredible perspective to have. Every day they're watching the weather and the changing weather and its impacts on local communities, and their personalities that everybody knows and listens to. So we're thrilled to have their participation. Also our other federal agency partners. There is a team here at the federal level that is working together. We all have a different piece, whether it's the Army Corps of Engineers or NOAA or the Forest Service. We're all working in the environment together, and I want to thank all of them, our federal partners who showed up today. Want to thank some other newer voices to conferences like this. Dar Williams and Russell Armstrong, tremendous cultural perspective, reaching people that we might not be able to reach otherwise, and feeling connected and empowered to audiences, who need to feel connected. So I want to thank them as well. And also all the folks behind the scenes. For months, we've been planning this with many of our state partners and state associations, local leaders. So just thank you for whatever you did behind the scenes. And it's really about three things for me. It's about engaging, making sure that we're reaching out and listening, whether it's internal, external, because we're all on team environment together. And that's important, that we're connected. It's no us against them. It's only us. To align, to make sure that we're bringing our specific competencies or experiences or perspectives or accountability to the table. We need everybody to work on one team together. And finally, to deliver, to get things done, to make sure that we're making a meaningful impact in the places that need it. And that's our focus here in the Biden-Harris administration, that we're investing in America and in every single corner. And in the 2+ years that I've been in this role, me and my team have met with many of you in every single corner of this region, from the southern coalfields of West Virginia, McDowell County, to Erie, Pennsylvania, in the upper northwest corner, to Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, in those historic communities in the northeast, and all the way down to Hampton Roads in the southeast, and hundreds of places in between. So we're showing up across sectors, across cities, urban and rural, and making sure that we're doing everything that we can to give a boost to the folks on the ground. And this EPA is a little bit different than maybe EPAs in the past, or the stereotypes of us. We are working closely with sectors that we haven't engaged so much before. We have been working closely with the agriculture community, with farms. We're reaching out to the private sector across the board, including factories. We're showing up to old cities. We're showing up to farmlands. Regardless of what kind of production farms are doing, we're engaging with them closely as well. We know that there's historic waterways that we all impact. There's 3 major ones in our region, and we've showed up to all of them. We're also showing up to the fence line communities, the places that border the polluters. And we're also showing up to beautiful national parks like the New River Gorge, our newest national park in West Virginia. And it's important that we do that because everybody's on shares a commitment to our environment, and we need to work together. Also, we're showing up in newer places that are sprouting up from old brownfields, and also neighborhoods that were once racially and economically segregated from redlining, communities that have been on the margins but not anymore. And all these places, we love to get out. We love to see what folks in the community see and live with every single day. So we've been walking the streets, we've been wading in the waters, we've been paddling, and we've seen and heard, and in some cases smelled, things that need our attention. So we're committed and we're engaged. And we still got a lot of work to do. Don't want to understate that in any way, shape, or form. But the good news is that we're working together, more than ever before. Across all these sectors, across all these different corners of our region. And again, no us against them. It's only us, and that's how we're doing it. Because we talk about these historic investments and all this level of funding that's never been available before, and that's great and that's important. But our measure of success is going to be whether we get these resources to the right people in the right places with the right projects, to make a difference, the places that need it the most. And that's where so many of you come in. And that's the alignment piece, alignment, making sure we're giving a boost to folks on the ground who are doing great work, who know what the solutions are, and that we're getting the resources in their hands, in your hands. And the delivery is important, to make sure that this isn't talk, this is walk. That at the end of the day, the wastewater treatment plants or the drinking water systems are upgraded and healthy, that kids are riding in more and more electric school buses, and that the bus drivers have a less stressful experience and one of the toughest jobs in our region. That's a big deal, that matters. Community solar, transitioning to more renewable energy, that we're investing in the capacity of tribes and community organizations because they're doing the work on the ground. We're supporting our teachers and our schools and our students because they're the future, and that we're working to make progress, in all of our historic waterways, the Delaware, the Ohio River watershed, and the Chesapeake Bay in between, that we're paying attention to all of them because folks see and hear and live in those watersheds every single day, and they deserve the highest quality of life and the cleanest water possible. But moving forward, we are going to continue to prioritize our commitment to these communities that have been historically on the margins, and that includes our tribes, in particular, our resilient First Nations that have had a historic connection to our. They, many of our waterways and some of our states even bear the names of these First Nations, and it's our commitment in this administration that we empower and help reconnect tribes to these historic lands, again, that often bear their names, and that we also listen and learn from them because they have incredible wisdom, incredible experience, and so much of our nation owes an incredible debt to them. So we are showing up and we're listening. And these communities that bear more than their fair share of stressors, with data and just with years and years of institutional knowledge and working with all sorts of activists and with the government, we know where many of these places are. We've identified 37 priority engagement communities, places that have environmental justice concerns. And they're not all urban. There's certainly urban stressors, but we know that rural communities are often forgotten, and we're engaging and showing up there and investing and walking in those communities and helping empower them for the solutions that they need. A lot of these environmental justice challenges, urban, rural, and everywhere in between, are decades and in some cases centuries in the making. They're complex, they're social, cultural, economic, as well as environmental, and we have to work together across many different disciplines, listen to many voices to help untie these stubborn knots that have been tied for too long. But, if anything is taken away from today, it's that EPA in our role, and we do have a role, but we can't do this alone. We need you. We need each and every one of you in the organizations and institutions in the neighborhoods that you represent. We have to build these partnerships, across sectors. Historical adversaries have to come together because we have so much to do. It's the only way that we're going to solve these stubborn problems and help hand a cleaner and healthier environment to the next generation. So if you're here today, I think you share that belief that change is possible, that we can get things done, that cynicism is not an option, as failure is not an option. You know, we have got to work together. And this includes the tough stuff. You know, climate change can feel very overwhelming, no question. These communities that have been stuck in cycles of environmental justice, you know, it can be disheartening and overwhelming, but change is possible when we work together. Change is possible when we're intentional. Change is possible when we care. And you know, I am committed to working together in undoing the false narrative that we're too divided, that, you know, rural can't work with urban, or that farmer can't work with environmentalist, or that working class folks can't work with academics. I do not believe that. I believe that we're one team and we have to, and we will work together. So going forward, you know, let's commit to that, to engage, you know, across, you know, all sectors and all different types of folks and communities to protect this incredible resource that we've inherited, to align that we're going to work together, that we're going to bring all of our skills and competencies together and perspectives to figure things out, and that we're going to deliver, that we're going to get things done, and then we're going to keep it moving. So if you couldn't tune in to everything today and there was a lot, or if you had to miss something or had to step away, or if you want to go back to something, no worries. We recorded each session. They'll all be available online in a couple of weeks, and we'll send a notice out to let you know about that. So please go back if you're interested in something, or if you want to share something with a colleague or a friend, don't hesitate. And also don't hesitate to stay in touch with us. You know, we, as you can tell, are highly engaged and highly committed to our common success. So don't be shy. You know, follow us on social media, and we have a lot of good stuff on social media. We're going to send you a survey as well to let us know what you thought about the summit. If you think there's anything we're missing or anything that we should do again, we want to know. But please don't be shy. We're on your team. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you in the upcoming months.